A top story this Thursday morning in a dramatic escalation, not unexpected, of trade tensions. US President Donald Trump has signed an executive order imposing an additional 25% tariff on all imports from India, citing New Delhi's continued purchase of Russian oil. So this makes it 50% tariff on Indian exports. Now, this move comes just weeks before crucial strategic and trade talks between the two nations marks a sharp turn in US-India relations and raises concerns of economic coercion under the guise of sanctions. Trump invoked emergency powers under US law, calling India's Russian oil imports a national security threat and warned of broader tariffs on countries engaging in similar trade with Moscow. The Ministry of External Affairs has sternly responded to Trump's tariffs. The US imposing additional tariffs on India is extremely unfortunate, says the statement. Several countries continue buying Russian oil in their national interest. India is not the only one. India also said that it strongly terms these actions as unfair, unjustified, as well as unreasonable. India will take all necessary steps to protect its national and strategic interests. But in another development, India's National Security Advisor Ajit Doval landed in Moscow yesterday in a pre-scheduled visit, now gaining urgency after Trump's tariff threat. Meanwhile, US Special Envoy Steve Witkoff is also in Moscow, and speculation is rife that the two may meet as both sides attempt to manage a rapidly spiraling situation. Though Trump has not softened up, friends of India are alarmed. Former US Ambassador to UN and fellow Republican leader Nikki Haley publicly questioned Trump's stance, writing on X, and I quote, "India should not be buying oil from Russia, but China, an adversary and the #1 buyer of Russian and Iranian oil, got a 90-day tariff pause. Don't give China a pass and burn a relationship with a strong ally like India," unquote. Now, what is America's reality? It has turned into a sanction regime. Since 1949, US has imposed 486 solo sanctions. Urjit Patel, former RBI governor, says that US has pioneered secondary sanctions on industrial scale, which relies on American financial system and supremacy of the US dollar. These sanctions have created problems for emerging economies, including India. So on the show, we discuss what next with both India and the US locked in a high-stakes strategic dance. And Russia right at the center. The question now is this a pressure tactic before the talks? Will strategic ties survive Trump's tariff test? Well, joining me on the show are two very special guests this morning. Barnik Chitran Maitra, PE investor and managing partner, Chrysalis Equity Ventures, as well as Mitali Nikore, founder and chief economist at Nikore Associates. Well, let's start with Barnik first. Barnik, good morning. Thank you so much for joining us here on the show this morning. Now, let's look at some of the unanswered questions that we are seeing and we are faced with right now. This Trump's latest tirade of 25% plus 25%, making 50% tariff on India. It leads to four critical questions, which I believe beg to be answered. Number one, there's a 21-day lead which is now given. There's a 21-day window after which this additional 25% tariff kicks in. Is Donald Trump hoping for some sort of a truce and some sort of an agreement to be reached before that 21%?
So I think it is unlikely that something definitive will be reached in 21 days, though the 21 days coincides remarkably with the next round of trade negotiations planned in the last week of August. So for me, this looks two things. One is a pressure tactic on India to get to a framework agreement before the end of August so that Trump can keep his promise of 90 trade deals in 90 days, which he's far below. He's got probably 5 or 6 trade deals and 40 letters. And the second more important geopolitical issue is that Trump's special envoy, Steve Witkoff, is in Russia. And this is also directed at Russia, where the president is pushing for a ceasefire or a peace deal between Russia and Ukraine. And I think the audience for this announcement is probably more Russia than India and is used more as a pressure tactic on Russia to also come to the negotiating table and agree for some kind of truce or a peace deal with Ukraine. So many moving pieces, right? You also refer to the story of our national security advisor landing in Russia. I think there have been news reports over the last week that the Indians have categorically said no to an F-35 purchase. So all of these things factor into the announcement yesterday. The unfortunate part of the US administration is they now believe that tariffs are the single blunt weapon they can use to counter everything which is going on around the world. And this is probably what they've done. But to be fair, I think let's see. The administration has postponed and paused tariff many times before. I wouldn't be surprised if there are progress made on the trade talks in the end of August. We may get further reprieve before a big framework deal is announced, probably closer to the fall.
Well, you've answered my second question also, which is whether this tariff is targeted towards India or Russia. But Mitali, let me bring you into this conversation. Now, Russia-linked tariffs are now likely to hit China as well as Brazil, presumably, because Donald Trump yesterday, answering a question by a journalist, said that it's only been 8 hours and there is going to be more announcement on Russia-linked tariffs. So is China and Brazil, are these countries likely to be next?
Absolutely, Kartik. I think, very frankly, if we look at the level of the tariffs which have been imposed, definitely unexpected, definitely, not in the interest of either the US consumer or the Indian consumer or the Indian business person. And having said that, I think at this point in time, like your previous guest also very rightly said, it is a tool to bring Russia to the negotiating table, and therefore, there have also been discussions of secondary sanctions this morning, and the BRICS bloc really being taken as the center of those secondary sanctions, and saying it's the BRICS countries that are going to be targeted. And that is why the president of Brazil has literally come and said, I will not speak to President Trump any further. I will only speak to Prime Minister Modi, because I think it's time for the BRICS bloc to really come together in letter and spirit, and make sure that they are opposing the unilateral actions of the president in this case.
Right. Of course, hold your thought on BRICS and this entire grouping and the geopolitics. We will come to that, Mitali, and I will bring your views back on that. But Barnik, let's just stay with the economics of these tariffs right now. Now, there are critical sectors under Section 232, and that includes pharma as well as electronics, and these have been kept out of the equation so far. So, technically for India, how big do you think is the blow if India were to go ahead and agree? I don't know if India has a choice right now. We look at India's options also. But if India were to be slapped with this 50% tariff, with this Section 232 items like pharma, semiconductors, electronics kept out of the equation, how big is the blow for the Indian economy?
I think the blow will not be significant. If you look at India's export to the US last year, it's around 87 billion, of which roughly 12% for smartphones. I think
Right.
smartphone exports have now actually quadrupled nearly, right, to 35% of the export basket. India is now the number one smartphone exporter to the US, beating China. If you add exports and pharmaceutical put together, which is out of the ambit of the tariffs, that will roughly be around 50-60% of the export basket which India does to the US. If you look at the remaining 30-40%, there will be certain sectors, notably auto components, maybe gems and jewelry, where India is competitive. The impact of the tariffs will be borne by a combination of the exporters, the importers, and the US consumer. And the remaining 15-20% in sectors like leather, apparel, capital goods, where there is competition and competitiveness, which neighbors like Vietnam, Bangladesh, where they are enjoying a tariff of only 20%, that's the component which will get hit. So it's maybe 15 to 20 billion dollars of exports at risk. And if you assume the fact that not all of them will be lost, I think there's an impact of the economy which is less than $10 billion, which is a small blip for our economy. So I think we should be patient. It's not going to be that big a deal. And as I've mentioned before, the likelihood of these tariffs getting postponed or paused till a trade deal gets done is quite likely. And given the fact that we are importing nearly 70-80 billion dollars of Russian oil, giving up strategic independence or giving up the savings we have, which are probably more than the sectors we will lose, right? So I think net, the impact has to be measured, but I don't think it's as significant as people may want it to be, or people may claim it to be. But let's look at the fine print of the deals, but not a big deal if you look at the full export basket, and also look at the trade deals India is negotiating with other partners. Because trade will flow to other countries. What's not going to the US may also flow to other countries with whom we are negotiating or have already negotiated trade deals like the UK.
That's right. So, of course, UK, EU could possibly be next for India to go ahead and sign the free trade agreement with. And then, of course, we have the EFTA with Switzerland and its neighboring countries. So there are new markets which are opening up. But I think businesses are going to need a little bit of runway to be able to negotiate those export markets and really find an alternative to US if the situation arises. But meanwhile, I want to pull up the leaderboard, the Trump tariff leaderboard, and really look at that in context, because here we are talking about a 50% tariff now slapped on India. Next comes Switzerland, which is at 39%, China still at about 30%, and then the rest of the country significantly lower than what India and China, at least at this moment, are dealing with. Though the deadline for China is much further than India's, but the fact is that there are countries like Bangladesh, which are now slapped with a 20% tariff as opposed to technically a 50% tariff on India, making Bangladesh's textile exports that much more lucrative. Similarly, you have countries like Vietnam, you have countries like, like even the Philippines, Indonesia, Japan, South Korea. All of these are in a much better competitive advantage as compared to India. So, Mitali, if these 50% tariffs on India were to stay, if India is not able to negotiate its way out of them, what is India's competitive advantage?
So I think, Kartik, the simple thing is, first of all, let's break it down by sector, right? As you rightly said, of course, textiles is one sector where countries like Bangladesh, Philippines, Vietnam, Indonesia, a lot of the East Asian, and of course, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Pakistan have all had a competitive advantage over India traditionally in international markets. And yet, India remains the supplier of choice when it comes to high quality textiles and also technical textiles, because when we're talking about textiles, it's not only ready made garments, but it's also a technical highly processed textiles where India is a global leader. So I think when it comes to these kind of high tech products, when it comes to high value added goods, there India will still retain a competitive advantage, simply because India is one of the few countries where these technical textiles are manufactured. But when it comes to, highly substitutable commodities, that is where India will lose out. And it's actually surprising because if we take the example of, say, shrimps, for example, the kind of
Half
tariff
billion
that we're
dollars or
talking about,
so.
if we have a Exactly. If we have a 50% tariff, even countries like Canada will be manufacturing actually more cheaply than India. And of course, because of the logistics cost being lower, will work out to be more competitive as compared to India. So I do think that India does stand to lose out quite a bit on specific sectors, and specifically newer sectors where we are trying to develop our high tech expertise, for example engineering goods, for example semiconductors. These are definitely areas where India wants to do more but may not be able to. And then there becomes a question around the production linked incentive scheme. The PLI scheme was started about 1.5 years ago, and we've been able to attract a lot of investment in sectors like electronics, in sectors like semiconductors, in sectors like manufacturing of consumer goods. And if these tariffs continue, then there is a disincentive for any foreign investor to come invest in India and set up manufacturing in India, because you don't know where the equation is going to change. So I think it's very, very critical for India to continue negotiating. While I fully agree that we have to diversify, and at some level the trust between the US and Indian negotiators is broken, the trust between the agencies is broken,
Hardest to
but at the
build,
same
wouldn't it?
time,
Mitali, wouldn't that be the hardest bridge to rebuild? Because once trust is out of the equation, what are you left with apart from some numbers on an Excel sheet?
exactly.
So,
Exactly. And it has been really difficult for this trust, building exercise to happen over the last 25 years, as our negotiators, as our economists, as our technocrats have engaged, and then the politicians have engaged because they've shown them the numbers. And now, again, the technocrats of both sides are very clear that it would be a win win situation for India and the US to trade more, which is why in February, the whole idea was to take Indo US trade to $500 billion a year. And now we're sitting at a point where India is slapped with the highest levels of tariffs only because, there is a certain perception that has been built against India. And I think that's the kind of trust building exercise that needs to restart, because that is the kind of global signaling that India still needs to give to the global investor.
Talk about global signaling, and let's really also talk about the geopolitics of everything that we are seeing unfold. Barnik, there are a few suggestions or a few sort of events which are in the making right now. Put all of that into perspective for us and tell us how to read it. Number one, Trump's likely meeting with Putin. Now, that is something which Trump himself has said that is likely to happen in a few days from now. Is that one scenario that should be on everybody's radar to try and see if that can ease the tariff pressure? Number two, Modi's visit to China. Now, that is again something where perhaps trade barriers could be eased, if not completely broken. Now, we've already spoken about Brazil's fallout with the US. Is this now the right time for the BRICS bloc to emerge even stronger and become a real strong trading partner? And finally, of course, there is one more geopolitical sort of event which takes the cake, and that is Trump versus the rest of the world. So now if Trump is going against pretty much its allies, including India, is the Quad under threat? Just put into perspective all these geopolitical events which are unfolding.
No, I think we are living in a world where I think a lot of the policy actions and the unpredictability of the administration actually harms American interests the most, right? I think, in fact, a friend of mine, a very notable US investor, told me yesterday that a lot of the actions are a little bit like cutting one's nose off to spite one's face, right? If you look at all the geopolitics put together in the quest for deals and deals done quickly, whether it be Russia or whether it be with India on the trade side, I think a decade-long trust foundations are being compromised, if any, right? I think the Prime Minister's visit to China end of the month also assumes significance, right? Which also affects the likelihood of India hosting Quad in October, because India is now supposed to host the Quad summit in October. And given what's going on, there is now a question mark on the Quad summit. All this actually makes the US bargaining power on the global stage weaker as years go by, right? So again, let's look at signals. Let's look at what happens in the meeting with the Russians next week. Let's see what happens when the Prime Minister visits the Shanghai Cooperation Council end of the month. What happens after trade negotiations? But I think all negotiators should understand that this is one administration with a midterm looming next year, and pretty much the likelihood of a lame duck president from next November onwards, and then a new administration from 2028. Uh, Trade deals take years to negotiate, take years to take effect. We should not be worried about what will happen to smart electronics. A lot of it is out of scope of the ambit, and investments which are coming into the country have a 5 to 7 year period. So while people are adopting wait and watch, I think we should be cautious that there are way too many moving pieces, including what India is doing with other countries, what the Americans are doing with the other countries, to take a hard call. But I think Mitali is correct when she says that this erodes the foundation of trust between two civilizational allies. We are actually far more closer to the Americans in terms of our shared values, our shared goals and aspirations than a lot of other countries. And this just puts the position of the US at risks, and actually emboldens and empowers blocs like the BRICS, which till a year back was struggling for relevance. And the president of the US has done a great marketing exercise of bringing it back into the spotlight and making it far more relevant. I think India and China can cooperate. There is something which the BRICS bloc can do to be far more meaningful in the medium and long term.
Barnik, Mitali, stay with us because we had promised our viewers that we will bring on the table likely scenarios and options available for India. We've broken these down into 4 potential scenarios which may not unfold. Let's look at them one by one and what our views as News9 are about the likelihood of those scenarios, and then I'll be happy to take your views as well. The first scenario, India will maintain its political posturing, which means India will continue like it has done in the past. Statements will be released on how India is reacting to what Donald Trump is saying and whether or not this is something which will eventually escalate or de-escalate is something that India will potentially wait and watch for. But right now, it seems, at least to us editorially at News9, that India maintaining political posturing is one of the scenarios which is a highly likely, a very likely scenario. What is the next scenario? The second scenario that we're really talking about is, can India or will India reduce and perhaps potentially at some point stop buying Russian oil? Now, to our understanding at News9, that seems like an unlikely scenario. India has said fairly clearly that it is going to safeguard its own economic as well as strategic interests. And in that scenario, discounted Russian oil is something which is of national importance, national economic importance to India. So it seems like an unlikely scenario. The next scenario that we are exploring for you this morning is that, is India in a position to, and will India at some point give in to Donald Trump's and his trade negotiators' demand of reducing entry barriers for American agri as well as dairy products to come into India? Well, to us at News9, that seems absolutely off the table. It's a highly unlikely scenario. It doesn't seem likely that India will relent on protecting its agri and dairy sector, its farm sector. And finally, the fourth scenario that we are playing with is India going to, and will India be in a position to escalate the trade war with the US like China had done? Is India going to escalate by retaliating with reciprocal or retaliatory tariffs? Is that something that India would do, could do in the future? We are not calling it very unlikely, but as we are standing here today, that seems like an unlikely scenario. I want to bring Mitali and Barnik back into these four scenarios, and quick, one word, agree, disagree, somewhat agree answers from you. Barnik, to you first. Scenario number 4, let's start with that. Retaliate and escalate the trade war. Is that something, to your mind, something that India would at some point have to do?
See, I think it is unlikely in the near term. It completely depends on the escalation ladder which the Americans seek to adopt, right? If the posture toughens and the rhetoric toughens, I think India has all these tools at its disposal. And given that the Chinese have done it once and have got the Americans to back down, scenario 4, or the option to invoke scenario 4, is something which India must never say no to. But I agree with your assessment. It's highly unlikely in the near term. Let's wait for a few weeks to see how the Americans change their posture, what happens in geopolitics. But this is a tool which the Indians will not be afraid to use if the situation comes to it.
Mitali, let's come to scenario 1, India to maintain its political posture. Is that something, to your mind, India will continue doing?
No, absolutely, Kartik. Completely agree with your assessment on scenario 1. And, I do think that India's political posturing might change in its tone. And I also think that I would like to add a scenario 5 here, something which you might have noticed has already begun on your WhatsApp and on social media. It's called the soft power approach, which India actually used when we had, some disagreements with Maldives. At that time, it was just a tweet, from the prime minister and from the administration saying Indians should actually holiday in India. We have so many beautiful beaches here. And the same, kind of messages have already started circulating saying, we buy so many American goods, we have so many American companies, we support so much of the American economy just sitting here. Maybe it's time for us to buy, Swadeshi and vocal for local. And I think that scenario 5 is something we're already starting to see play out. And it kind of links with your scenario 1, right? Because, of course, we maintain a formal political posture. But at the same time, informally, we start, using our soft power to nudge people away and to invoke that nationalism, to invoke that patriotic feeling. And to be very honest, I'm sure even between all of us, I am feeling like today I don't want to buy a Starbucks. I'm going to go and get a cup of tea from Chayos.